All righty, boys and girls, welcome back to another on the road episode of the Red, White, Claret, and Blue Show with your hosts, Alex and Chris Bean Counter Condit, your American villain voices, and as always, serving up the lukewarmest of lukewarm opinions. And we got a particularly hot episode today as we dive into Villa's ability to navigate the treacherous waters that are PSR. But before we get to that, please go follow the socials, linked in the show notes. Please listen to us, rate, review, subscribe on Amazon, Apple Music, YouTube. Get in the comments. We actually do respond now. We figured out how to see those and respond to them. So if you jump in those comments, we will finally respond to you. Chris, I haven't seen you in a while. It is lovely to see your face. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, and I hope you are. It has been a while. It's just been, there for a while there just wasn't a lot of news happening on the Villa front, so there hasn't been a reason to have a podcast recently. But that changed yesterday, huh? As expected, Villa are selling the women's team to V Sports largely. At least looks like 90% of the shares are going to go to V Sports. Happens to be owned by the same people that own Aston Villa, and then 10% are going to an outside investor, an American investor, according to rumors. So that's exciting stuff, and it obviously has major implications for Villa going forward for the next year. And it's good news. It's a really good piece of news to start things off. So I feel like I'm in a great mood because there's like a weight lifted off your shoulders now with PSR not hanging over us for at least the next, few months. We don't have to worry about it for the time being. We have other issues that need to be addressed, but we'll get to those here in the pod.
So let's take a moment to pat ourselves on the back once again. We are killing the reporting over the past couple weeks because, we broke the stadium news story, which then flooded Villa Twitter.
And is now pretty much just accepted as fact, by the way.
Yeah, accepted as fact. These two guys, by the way, Claret and Blue Show, I want you to acknowledge who actually broke this news. Not John Townley, Alex Beccaro and Chris Condit, please. Okay, thank you. And second of all, in our last episode, we said rumors have gone quiet. You said we haven't had a podcast for a while because there wasn't really news coming out. And that's because all the Leon Bailey, Emmy Martinez, all these sales that were supposed to happen by June 30th to help us meet PSR went away. Why? Well, we were right. There was something simmering in the background. And what was simmering in the background was Villa was unconcerned because they were negotiating a price for their women's team. So let's dive right into that. Sold the women's team for £55 million. Rumors are that the warehouse is next, God knows how much, and then the stadium naming rights will be sold after that. So you have to imagine a couple other tens of millions will be coming in across those two assets. More importantly, this sale announced on the last day completely eliminated our PSR concerns in the EPL. There are still some thoughts out there that we need to figure out the squad cost ratio rules for UEFA because of different time horizons and all that kind of stuff. We'll get to that in a second. But eliminate all concerns. We're not under the gun to sell someone like a Douglas Luiz for under market value. It gives us the full summer to kind of figure out what those sales are going to be. And frankly, through the next season now, right? We closed our books. We've got a whole year now to figure out the sales and the ways to increase our revenue to get us into compliance. As you said, the women's team has been sold to ourselves, exploiting the same loophole that Chelsea utilized a couple years ago. So before I ask you how all of this is possible, because as our resident bean counter, you are the one who I go to with all our finance needs, despite my Wharton degree. I think the price is interesting, right? So much like when we talked about the stadium naming rights, and you rightly pointed out all these people that said, well, let's just sell the naming rights for $50 million. And we're like, we can't do that.
Right.
I think that there has been some reaction on the women's team. If Chelsea got 200 million, why did we only get 55? Well, Chelsea is arguably maybe the second or third best women's team in the world.
Right.
We are sixth in the Women's Super League. We're certainly worth something. Yes. But as with all of these associated party transactions like Man City, the idea is to keep it above board in the sense of like, this is a reasonable amount to expect. Chelsea is probably worth 4 times what our women's team is. Secondly, you see why Villa was a fairly vociferous opponent to the Premier League's attempts to legislate this out as a goal to exploit for PSR, because they could do the same thing, and they didn't want to shut the door when Chelsea were the only team that were able to leverage this to their advantage. And we talked a couple episodes about how, despite all their expenditures, Chelsea are somehow 200 some odd million in the green. Their women's sale was part of the reason for that. So, Chris, please, that's enough of me talking. Please explain to the cognoscenti here how this is even possible and what this means for our PSR concerns.
Right. So you are absolutely right that the market valuation has to be fair. Otherwise, it's going to get flagged by the Premier League, just like a shirt sponsor or any other type of agreement, whether it's to a parent company like Villa are doing or like Chelsea did, or whether it's to an outside vendor. This all has to be worth fair market value. And so the valuation that Chelsea used when they came up with that $200 million value was, they actually looked at the LAFC women's team, I believe, was what they used as their sort of marker. And that was how they came to their number, and the Premier League agreed that was a fair market value. So I think what Villa did here was consider that number, look at where Villa are in the standings and in terms of the growth of their women's game. And I will point out that a couple of years ago, or 1 year ago, they sold their most valuable asset in Alison Lehman to Juventus. So did I say Allison? Alicia Lehman, I'm sorry, to Juventus. So the club, because of her star power off the pitch, becomes less valuable when she's not on it. I mean, that's a fact of life. So I think that the market valuation is good and fair and will pass muster, which is a key point here. And in terms of how this alleviates PSR concerns, it's twofold, really. If you consider the 3-year rolling window that we're looking at, we're coming out of a particularly difficult stretch where we as Villa spent an awful lot of money in the previous 3 seasons. But in the last 2 seasons, Villa's net spend on player transfers has actually been positive. So that allows this sale for £55 million, according to rumors, to bring us to PSR solvency, for lack of a better word. But it's because of the maneuvering that's been done over the last 2 seasons in particular with player sales. So we're talking about the Douglas Luiz sale, the funny selling back and forth between Chelsea and Aston Villa for probably over market value. If we're going to talk about bending rules, and we are, that's where Villa had bent the rules, because they're selling players to other clubs that aren't worth that amount of money. But they had somebody that was willing to make the trade because it helped them as well. Right. So because of the diligence of Villa's recruitment and player acquisition team, they've now put themselves in a position with this sale to be above board for PSR for the next 364 days. That's the key, is that this doesn't stop because of this sale. Next year, we're going to have the same thing. Villa are always going to be in this position until we have sustained European success and revenue to support it. So that it's always going to be difficult unless the rules change, or unless we have sustained success that brings in the revenue like we saw this past season in Champions League.
And let's actually, I want to put a finer point on that last bit that you mentioned there, because it's one level beyond that I don't think that everybody, I know that but I don't think that everybody gives credit for. It is not sustained European success alone,
right,
that keeps us solvent and not needing to continually kick this can down the road and find other creative accounting measures to beat whatever the PSR rules are. It is the fact that sustained European success is going to result in more consistent, elevated commercial success
Correct.
that is ultimately going to eliminate PSR. It is not competing in the Champions League 5 years in a row, assuming that nothing changes on the sponsorship front. It is the fact that 5 years in a row of European success means that Adidas is willing to pay more for the kit deal. It means that whoever signs on for the stadium sponsor is willing to pay more for that. It is the fact that the side badge sponsor, the sponsor of the training ground, if we sell Bodymore Heath, like all these other things, to be the official airline, the official fast food partner, whatever, pay more money for that, because those are locked in 3-5+ year contracts that do not change much regardless of which league you're in. That's why the Big Six are able to get the money that they do, is because they sell commercially, not because they're in Europe every year. You see what Manchester United
Correct.
is able to spend regardless of whether they're in Europe or not. So it's what continued European success allows us to do. Right now, the club is in the position of, we need to kick the can of PSR down the road as far as humanly possible to allow us to get the best players in, to allow for the sustained on-field success that leads to the more sustained off-field success that
Correct.
ultimately is what's going to eliminate PSR for us.
That's exactly right. And I mean, it may come to a time that the Premier League changes the PSR regulation, if not scraps it altogether. I don't think scrapping it is likely, but changing it seems more likely now than before, because of the way that clubs like Aston Villa, for one, but also Nottingham Forest and Chelsea are utilizing the rules to their advantage. That's how I would put this. You know, the reaction online was kind of surprising to me, in that most of the fans of other teams similar to Villa, Newcastle United specifically, seemed to be the loudest group, at least that I saw on my timelines, seemed more angry with Aston Villa for exploiting this loophole than for the system in place in the first place, which seems silly to me, because the system is, if I can go on a bit of a soapbox here, is not fit for purpose any longer, and probably wasn't ever fit for what it was meant to do. And there are many unintended consequences to this system, this being one of them, that kind of have resulted in teams finding creative accounting ways to work around the system. And you know, the Villa ownership group has said as much, that they feel more like bean counters than sports owners, because they are constantly trying to figure out ways to work around the PSR issues. And what I would point out is that one of the things that I don't think gets talked about enough with the way the system was currently set up, which it came into play in 2013-14, that system, that allocation of 105 million pound over 3 years, has never been adjusted for inflation. So we've now had this since 13-14. So that's you know, almost 12 years. That would be worth 142 million today, adjusted for inflation. So unless you freeze wages and purchase prices for players, like, immediately this system doesn't work, because you can't expect teams to have this cap that doesn't adjust, but wages are up, cost of purchasing players is coming back down, but for a while there, particularly in the COVID and post-COVID time, skyrocketed. I mean, Declan Rice, Jack Grealish, just as examples of 100 million pound players that probably wouldn't draw near that today, because I think we're seeing something of a market correction. But the idea that this cap, this limit, doesn't adjust as prices go up is the first problem, and it's a major problem with this system, because the teams that already have high revenue are going to have more flexibility against that cap than the clubs that are trying ambitiously to break that system. Newcastle, Aston Villa, Nottingham Forest, to some extent at this point. they are clubs like this are always going to be up against that number, much more so than the clubs that were at the top and popular, particularly abroad in 13-14. And just to hammer that point home, I actually went back and looked and went through the season standings since PSR was introduced. So they started in 2013-14, like I said. Since that time, the EPL standings at that point were Man City 1, Liverpool 2, Chelsea 3, Arsenal 4, Everton 5, Tottenham 6, and Man United 7. All right, so that's 12 seasons now of PSR. That would mean there are 72 top 6 spots over that time. So 72 opportunities to finish in the top 6. The traditional Big 6 have finished in 63 of those spots. So outside of those 63, there have been 9 times that a non-Big 6 club has finished in the top 6 since 2013-14. So if this system was...
2 of which are Aston Villa.
Correct.
Right?
2 of which are Aston Villa. So if this system was designed to make things more equitable and fair, it has done the opposite. And it has shut the door to keep other teams out because they can't possibly spend what a Man United can spend, what an Arsenal can spend, what a Man City can spend, largely because outside of Man City, who are potentially cooking the books, but largely because, like, if you take Man United, terrible on the field, particularly in the last year, they were, I mean, near the bottom of the table, have £1 billion £1 billion in debt, but they can still spend freely because they generate so much revenue because they had Wayne Rooney in the 90s and got popular in America, and Americans spend money like that, and Asians spend money. Like that's really what drives their ability to continue to spend. It has nothing to do with what they've done over the last 20 years, because largely they've been a middling sort of big club. 6, 7, 8 has been their finishing places much of the time until last season. So that's a long rant to kind of hammer home that this system, which was intended to make things more fair and equitable and make it so that you can't be a Chelsea and just buy your way into a title, but what it has done is stop any team that really wants to try and grow because you can't overspend no matter how much money your owners have and are willing to spend. So I'm not saying no, I'm going to say it again. I'm not saying no restrictions, because that doesn't work either. But this arbitrary 35 million pound a year number doesn't make any sense.
So I'm going to disagree with you slightly. In that I do not think that the purpose of these rules were to make everything more fair and equitable. The rules are called profit and sustainability rules. These rules came into play in the wake of Portsmouth potentially going insolvent, Bury going under, Wigan being up against it. These traditionally, I won't say like big clubs, but clubs having reckless owners that spent them into debt, potentially leveraged the club's assets to fuel some sort of attempted rise up the table, got bored, sold, stopped funding it, whatever. And you saw this past week what happened with Sheffield Wednesday and the risk that they are of going completely insolvent. So I don't want to confuse the issue of where these rules came from. I think that in an effort to promote sustainability, to ensure that no one had a Dr. Tony Gia that came within 5 pounds of Aston Villa no longer existing as an entity.
But
in
we
an
had
effort
that.
But in
in
an effort
the time of PSR.
Right. But in an effort to restrict that, I'm not saying that it works, but in an effort to restrict that, I think that to the point that you made, they absolutely shut the door and restricted any sort of competitive equity. Now, when the rules are still allowing Villa to potentially borderline go insolvent, or allowing for Sheffield Wednesday to potentially go insolvent, you are absolutely right. They're not fit for purpose, even in that objective. Right. But I don't think that they're a failure in trying to promote competitive equity, because I don't think that was the point in the first place.
I mean, that's
And
a fair point. That's a fair point. And I would also point out that, like, Manchester City having £1 billion in debt, most of it in the form of loans to their owner, is
yeah,
also not sustainable.
no,
I mean,
totally not.
it
I'm
is
not
sustainable
stating
for
any
the
aspect.
Glazers, right? Yeah, like, so it's sustainable for the Glazers in the same way that it would be sustainable for Villa's ownership group. It's sustainable for them, but in no real world is having to take out loans against your own ownership group a sustainable business practice to the tune of £1 billion, and they pay more in interest, than many expenditures of many clubs across the pyramid.
So you kind of addressed we had two cold waters that
Yeah.
we were going to discuss here, and you kind of addressed the first one of Newcastle fans being big mad, calling this a sham. The only thing that I'll add to that, I don't get it either. I'm pouring cold water on that. We are using the rules to our advantage, and like, it sucks that you haven't invested in your women's team because your ownership group is extremely oppressive against women. No wonder you didn't spend there. Ha,
That's right.
gotcha. I also don't understand, to a point that I think you were getting to. I almost feel like they should be, and maybe I'm naive for saying this, but I feel like they should be on our side. We are of a like mind in that, to your point, we are clubs that were traditionally shut out from that Big Six. Put their ownership group aside for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Clubs traditionally shut out from the Big Six that have found over the past few seasons ways to compete and to get involved and to break that glass ceiling. And to a certain extent, I was rooting for, until it became us or them, I was rooting for Nottingham Forest to make the top 4, top 5, top 6 last year, because it's just nice to see someone else break in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'd think that, instead of essentially taking the side of Manchester United, who's upset that we didn't need to sell them Emi Martinez at a cut price deal,
Right.
they're basically taking their side instead of ours. Really?
It's crazy. I agree.
And support a system that allows all the big clubs to poach your players?
Yeah.
I just don't. I would be mad at your own ownership for not finding ways around this, for continuing to oppress women now in the city of Newcastle and not allow them to pursue their football dreams. Don't get mad at us for actually investing in our women's team. But Chris, let's talk about the second one for a sec, because I think I'm interested to hear your point here. We texted about this a little bit yesterday, and you never actually gave me a response. Some random dude on Twitter named Peter Malcolm tweeted at the great Kira Maguire and said, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, Villa City and Chelsea have all bent the rules to find loopholes to allow this to happen. And why shouldn't they? But the rules need to change. And you and I had a decent discussion around what bending and loophole meant. So I'm going to give you the floor to articulate your point before I give you mine.
Sure. It's absolutely a loophole. There's no question about that. And the Premier League had talked about closing the loophole, but they couldn't even bring it to a vote because they didn't have close to the 14 clubs they needed to close the loophole. So it is a loophole in the rules that allow ownership groups via holding companies to buy and sell assets to themselves. That is a loophole that Villa, Chelsea, really, that's the two biggest examples we're going to use. But Villa and Chelsea have exploited that loophole in the rules. So the reason I take issue with the idea of this is bending the rules is it's explicitly allowed by the rules. It's not it's not bending them. Like I said, the closer version of bending the rules to me would be selling players that are worth £6 million for £25 million. Chukwuemeka comes to mind, Carney Chukwuemeka, but he wasn't worth 6, but he wasn't worth 25 either, so like that is bending the rules, because both parties knew that was not what the player was worth, right? Selling an asset that is, that's going to pass the test in terms of the fair market value test. Selling an asset to your holding company is permitted. The rules allow for it. So I don't think that's bending the rules. And I think if the rules change, that's fine. But I think you have to make much larger changes than that. You can't just say, all right, you can't sell assets to yourself anymore, but also we're not making any changes to the PSR regulations as they stand.
Right. Yeah.
I think you need to, if you're going to make changes, you need to make wholesale changes that really take a look at. Like I said, I think there are a lot of unintended consequences to these PSR rules, and I think that the Premier League needs to take a long look at how best to do this in the future. And I don't think this is the route.
So I'm actually not pouring any cold water on this statement. I will pour cold water on the idea of it being like quote unquote bad, or if it's being equated to cheating. For me, and actually I think your differential between bending versus not of the rules is fine. I don't necessarily agree, but like I understand where you're coming from. I think that bending the rules can be defined as anything that is not done in the spirit of the rule. And while I have not read the exact legal definition within the Premier League that allows for the discounting or bookable revenue of investments into the women's team or sales of the women's team or things of that sort, I can guarantee you that selling it to your old holding company was not part of the spirit of the rule.
Right.
Whenever they came up with this regulation that allowed clubs to essentially write off, Schitt's Creek reference, write off any investment in their women's football team. So from that perspective, I will say Villa and Chelsea are absolutely bending the rules when they find a loophole. I don't think you can find a loophole and not bend the rules. That's just my 2 cents on it. But I don't think that there's anything bad on it. Now, what I do actually pour cold water on, though, is equating what Villa and Chelsea are doing with what Man City did.
Yeah.
And that is because Man City broke the rules. They cooked the books. They lied on allegedly, I guess. Let's not get sued.
We'll throw the allegedly in there. That's right. Allegedly.
Yeah. On what they were getting paid for by who and who that money was coming from. That is not bending the rules. That's breaking the rules. Right. I think that you can say that Villa and Chelsea have bent the rules to sell this. Now, I understand, to your point, you know, the way they valued some of these players, that they've swapped Lewis Dobbin for 12, whatever it is.
I forgot about him.
Inflated value that we're spending, and that's probably closer to breaking, but it's technically not. That's just more of a bend. You're like going down to like 89, or I guess we're gonna say you go to like 89 degrees as opposed to 90 degrees. But that I guess that's why I pour a little less cold water on it than you.
Yeah, no, I think we're ultimately saying the same thing, and we're arguing, we're splitting hairs over semantics. Yeah. But I also want to point out, like, I agree. I would pour a lot of cold water into comparing what Chelsea and Villa have done to Man City, because what Man City is charged with. I'm not saying they did it because we don't want to get sued. But what they are charged with is large scale financial fraud. It's not. Yes. It's not like a couple of things here and there where, there was an extra $5 in the coffer and they just pocketed it or whatever, or whatever. No, large scale fraud over a period of years is what they're being charged with. So let's calm down on putting the folks who are trying to find ways around PSR restrictions to that,
Exactly. So now that we've successfully navigated PSR for June 30th and it is July 1st, there still are likely to be player exits over the course of this summer. This doesn't change the fact that we do probably need to sell to invest.
Yes.
So, as we've been teasing for a couple weeks now, we have power ranked the squad based on their likeliness to be sold, not whether we want to sell them. Just when we're reading the tea leaves and thinking about where the team needs to develop and the type of news that has come out about these guys, How likely is it, do we think that we will be bidding adieu to some of the guys that were on the first team squad last year? Before we dive into that, though, just a few notes. Already confirmed to be gone. Courtney Hawes and Robin Olsen were released, and our lone players, Rashford, Asensio, and Disasi, you saw the release yesterday. They've gone back to their parent clubs. They were thanked for their service. There's some reading into that to say that they might not be coming back. There are rumors saying that PSG is really negotiating hard over Asensio, and Rashford is dead set on going to Barcelona. Let's assume they're gone.
Yep.
About to be gone, if not confirmed gone already within the past 24 hours. Coutinho apparently agreed to a contract termination.
Thank God.
It's about time. I still will always thank him for the recruitment job that he did in coming here to Villa. Thank God the wages are off the books.
Yeah.
KKH, who is it? Plymouth's player of the season last year, sold to Coventry for somewhere between 3.5 to 5 million with a sell-on clause. And Louis Barry just earlier today confirmed, per Jacob Tanswell, 3.5 million to Hull with a quote-unquote substantial sell-on fee.
Yep. I think that was also the hang up. That deal almost died on the table. If you read the social media today and yesterday, I think that was the hang up, was that Villa wanted a pretty decent sell-on clause to that, and Hull didn't want to add that clause to the contract. I think that these are all good moves. I'm surprised at how much people are pining for Kessler Hayden when, and people think that this was not enough money for him. I mean, he didn't play well in the Premier League when he got his chances, and then he played really well last season. But I think he's somewhere between a 4 and an 8 million pound player. I think that's a fine sale, and it's a good deal for Coventry. Don't get me wrong. You get what looks like a talented player, but let's not make this guy out to be something he's not, or at least he wasn't.
And he's basically only done it for one season. And don't forget the sell-on, right? That's going to theoretically come back with more money, to your point, get you in the $8 million range. If you take out the sell-on, championship to championship. Imagine if he was sold, you found out that there was someone who was sold from Plymouth to Coventry. What would you expect them to go for, even if they were Plymouth's player of the season? 10 max, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, absolute max, though, right?
Absolute max. Right. Absolute max. Blow it out of the water, probably 10 million pound. So 5 million with a sell on, goes somewhere else. We get it up to 7 or 8, feels right.
Yep.
So who's left? We've got in the goalkeeping department, Emmy, Gauchi, Gauchi, Zick, and Marshall. Defenders, Cash, Garcia, Costa, Konsa, Mings, Torres, Bogard, Dean, Matson, Moreno, and Sammy Ills, who really could be defender, midfielder, or forward. I don't really know where to put him. Midfielders, Barkley, McGinn, Yuri, Buba, Onana, Enzo, and Dendonker is coming back. Forwards, Bailey, Rogers, Mullen, Ramsey, Buendia, and Dobbin, aforementioned Dobbin. And our lone striker, Oliver Watkins. Mm-hmm. So we've got 4 tiers of our power ranking here. We actually made an intentional decision to not explain to each other what these meant. So I'm actually curious to see how you read these. But the categories are entitled, Who Cares? Wolf of Wall Street, I'm Not Leaving. The Right Price Unlocks It. And Don't Get Comfortable, We're Pushing You Out the Door.
Yeah, I think we're in alignment here for the most part. I just realized there's one note I needed to make here to not look like an insane person, so I'm going to add that to
I was curious about that one, actually. Yeah. When I read it, I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start with the quick one. Who cares what happens to them? I have our 3 goalkeepers excluding Emi Martinez, so Zick, Gauchi, Marshall. I have Garcia in this category, Leander Dendonker, and Lewis Dobbin.
I have all the same, except I didn't put Garcia in there, only because I think that based on the position he plays,
I'm looking at your list. You don't have him
He's
anywhere.
he's meant to be in the either the right price unlocks it or we're pushing you out the door, depending on how we break that down.
Fair enough.
So I think based on positional need at the moment, which is a terrible evaluator of talent, but based on positional need, I think he's not in the who cares category because right now we kind of need him for cover, you know. But
That's
everybody else is the same. And I mean, Den Donker, I want you. Can I put him in the pushing out the door category as well because his wages are outrageous. I think he's on like 125K a week. It's unsustainable.
Yeah, I struggled with what to do with him.
Yeah.
And so I kind of wrote him in both categories of who
Yeah.
cares and we're pushing you out the door because the wages, you're right. All the other guys on here are guys who are young, who I don't really expect to contribute much to the first team, if at all. We had
Right.
a brief flirtation with Garcia in the middle of the season. I think with how much he played over the
Right.
latter months, it kind of shows, that it was just a purchase for cover when Costa went out the door. I don't really have high hopes for him. The reason why I have him on who cares is because, $8 million from a Spanish second division squad. I'm sure he's on very low wages.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that we necessarily need to push him out the door. We just don't really care whether he sticks around or not.
That's fair. Yeah, I don't think we're the only reason I'm saying to hang on to him at least for now is the positional need. That we don't have any cover for cash.
Do you? I guess interesting question. Do you think he is more or less likely to stick around, take price out of it than Costa?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more smoke around Costa leaving right now, and so that also factored in my decision, right? In terms of where to put him. Yeah, so I would love Costa to stay because I think there's a heck of a player in there. I think that right now there's a whole lot of smoke about Costa not being at Villa at the end of the summer here.
That's fair. All right, so we'll get to those. Let's get another quick section out of the way. Wolf of Wall Street, I'm not leaving. Why don't you read yours first?
Sure. I think we're pretty aligned on these. It's Konsa, Mings, Maatsen, McGinn, Rogers, and Daniel Malen for me. And I think we're close to aligned. I think, and the reason I think the first five are self-explanatory. Konsa is our best defender. Mings is the heartbeat of the team still, and very
signed a new contract.
Yeah, and he just signed a new contract and very capable. Ian Maatsen is, I think, like if you could design a back for Unai Emery to play with, like that's what he would create in a lab. And John McGinn is also a heartbeat of the team, and you can't really get rid of him. Morgan Rogers, the club has come out and said that he is untouchable. And then Daniel Malen, you and I talked about him a lot at the end of the season. He didn't necessarily see a ton of minutes, but I think we're going to see him a lot more featured in the coming season for two reasons. One, he's going to have a full summer of training with Unai Emery and the squad, and his positional fluidity, for lack of a better term, makes him a very attractive piece to hang on to because you can play him in so many different positions. And in the short time that he was on the pitch in season last year, we said it multiple times, the guy was electric coming onto the pitch. So I think that's another player that's one to watch. And I don't think that Unai Emery would let him go for almost any amount of money.
You also think
reasonable amount of money,
a reasonable amount of money, sure. And who's going to offer more than what Villa paid for him now?
Exactly.
So like, why flip him?
Yeah.
The only other one that I had that you don't, and this is a potentially hot take on my end, I don't think Matty Cash is going anywhere. I don't think that people are paying significant dollars for him. I don't think that he necessarily wants to go. I think that, we saw, for better or for worse, whatever you think about him, The back four was much more solid when Matt Cash was in it and healthy last year. So even if we bring in a new right back, I think that is for competition with Matt Cash, not because Matt Cash is going out the door. I don't see a world in which he leaves and we just bring in someone new with Garcia as the only backup.
I agree. I still put him in the next category, and we can explain that why.
Yep.
So the next category is the right price unlocks it. And why don't you do yours first?
Okay. So I think, it's kind of funny. Nearly everyone sans Rodgers and Mings, I guess, since he just signed a new contract, could theoretically be in this category,
Yep.
right? If we're going to be like 100% honest about it, the right price, probably we would sell nearly anyone in the squad if someone was willing to come in and pay over the odds for him. But
Yep.
for the sake of argument with the rest of this, I had Pau Torres, Lamar Bogard, Luka Dean, Ross Barkley, Yuri Tielemans, Amadou Onana, Jacob Ramsey, and Watkins.
Yeah. So I had the same with Emmy Martinez in there. So you didn't have him, and Matty Cash. I put a question mark with Onana because I think that right price is going to be pretty
It's
high.
astronomical.
Yeah, like that. So I also think if you've watched his interviews here in the offseason and the things that he said about playing at Villa and playing with Unai Emery or for Unai Emery, he seems like he's enjoying his time here, and he seems like he's really taking heed what Unai Emery is trying to drill into him. So he's another one that I think that, to use my same analogy, if Unai Emery could design a defensive midfielder in a lab, I think it would look a lot like Onana. Just, and the amount that we paid for him, I don't think anybody's going to give us that, So
That's fair.
I think he's probably going to stay based on that. But in Matty Cash, you made a lot of good points in the previous round. I just think if somebody offered an amount of money that I don't think we're going to get for him, they would sell,
That's fair.
That's all.
I'll give a quick on all these guys.
Yeah.
Pau Torres, we obviously know how much Unai loves him. It would be a very high price, but I think if Real Madrid comes calling with Real Madrid money, he's gone. Bogard, there's not a ton of smoke around him, but I think you saw how he really fell out of favor over the latter half of the season after that experiment early on between the right back, the center back. So I don't know how much he's really desired to stay around. If someone offered up 12 million, would the club take it? Maybe. Pure profit, good player. Luka Dean, plenty of smoke. Ross Barkley, he was only 5 million last year, probably could make a decent profit. And then, with Enzo coming back, maybe who we'll get to in the next section, is he still necessary or is he surplus to requirements? Yuri, pure profit. Is this the best season that we're going to see out of him? Maybe, as much as Unai Emery likes him. You mentioned Onana, Jacob Ramsey, pure profit. We've continued to see the rumors, and he continues to have injury problems. And then Ollie Watkins, we know how close the club was to selling him in January. So, you got to throw him in this category now.
If they got 50 million for him, they'd sell him right now. There's no
doubts about that.
Yeah. So I agree with your assessment on all those. So I'm the one that I have different than you is I have Emmy Martinez. I think
and Boubacar Kamara.
And Booba, that's right. And Booba. So contingent on Kamara. Contingent on whether or not he signs a deal. The longer he goes without signing a contract, the more he moves to the next category.
Yep. So last category, don't get comfortable. We're pushing you out the door. Who you got, Chris?
Well, I have Alex Moreno, Sam Illing Jr., Enzo, Leon Bailey. Oh, I listed Emi Buendia twice, and Costa because of all the smoke around him. And again, I think that maybe to some extent they view him as surplus to what they need. And I think that they would get a decent fee for him against what they paid.
I was about to say not just surplus, but someone that could probably turn a profit in
Yeah.
fairly short succession after purchase.
Yeah.
Even though Leipzig didn't activate the clause in the loan deal, the fact that the clause was written at 20 some odd million probably indicates that someone out there is willing to spend between 15 to 20 on a guy that we spent 8, I think, give or take, 8
Correct.
to 12.
Yep.
So I think he would be gone. Emi Buendia, obviously, he's basically out the door. Too bad that Leverkusen didn't trigger that
Right.
clause for him. Enzo, I'm a bit surprised by, to be honest, with how well he did at Valencia and how highly he was regarded. I'm surprised that for every one story that says that he's going to be given a shot in preseason, which do exist. There are some stories saying that he's going to be given a shot. There seem to be 3 or 4 saying that he's going to be sold back to La Liga for seemingly as little as like 10 to 15 max,
Right.
which kind of surprises me.
Yeah.
Particularly with Kamara potentially on the way out if he doesn't sign a contract. I'm surprised that you wouldn't keep him around to potentially deputize, because as we've said, we see Onana more as a replacement for Yuri Tielemans than a deep-lying defensive midfielder the way that Kamara is. Buba, I know you had him in the right price on Locksit. I am probably leaning more into your explanation of the tea leaves saying that he's not going to sign a contract and therefore we will push him out the door when he still has 2 years remaining.
Yeah.
Sammy Ills is a championship level player, and I think that that's where he'll be sold. Alex Moreno, no need to discuss, mentioned Costa. And I think that based on the interviews that he's given, and honestly, even the interviews that we've heard out of the team, there is a desire to move Emi Martinez on for big money and potentially bring in a young goalkeeper, Chevalier. But because of the love that he has for the club and obviously the respect and admiration that we have for him, I just think that no one wants to come out and say it. But I do think that he's being ushered to the door.
I mean, if you can spin him Martinez for Chevalier or someone like that, I think that's a win if you consider length of time that you're going to be able to use them, as a player.
Yeah, sure.
You still build the statue of Emi Martinez, because of what he's meant to this club. But also one player that we didn't mention, there have been 2 signings since the start of July, but one player that I think kind of changes maybe the thinking defensively is Yasin Özcan, the young player from Turkey, primarily a center back, but also plays some left back. So I think that gives you a little more flexibility in terms of who you're willing to see go defensively. And Özcan has a ton of major service time. He's only 18, 19, but he's played more minutes at top flight level than like Jacob Ramsey. Shout out Love of Paul McGrath podcast for that stat that I saw. So like that, I think that I think he's going to be a player that we see come in relatively quickly, not necessarily as a regular starter, but as a rotational player, as a player coming off the bench, as a player in cup games. Even though he's young, I think you're going to see him early. I really do.
That's a good shout by you because Ashkan now, obviously, it's a step up from playing for Kasımpaşa to Aston Villa, the Premier League and Europa League. But senior caps for Turkey, you saw Unai Emery willing to experiment with a very young Lamar Bogart last year in a variety of different positions. So
in Champions League,
in Champions League, in the Premier League, important matches. So to rewind it a season even further, young Tim got a start against Man City in the latter stages of that season. So he's willing to give guys minutes who he feels like deserve it. Does that mean that you could maybe move on a Luka Dean and not feel the loss as much because you've got a left back deputy and that's where he starts? You also hear good stuff about his mentality. Supposedly, he's already signed up for. He's moved to England and signed up for English classes so that he can really get integrated with the team. Like a lot of good press coming out.
Mm-hmm.
If I were a betting man, no comment on whether I am or not, I would probably guess that he still gets loaned out at some point this year.
I think so.
But he is certainly an interesting one.
I think that depends on what happens here in the transfer window.
That's probably fair.
If the team Villa stand pat largely with the back four, I think then yes, then he'll likely get loaned out. But I think that you've got Luca Dean is the name that keeps coming up. Part of the reason for that is his wage, and the Villa have a commitment now to reduce the wage bill. That's what I want to say before we get too far ahead of ourselves. We talked about being clear of PSR for the year. Villa still have to reduce their wage bill to get under European SCR, and they're going to have to do that this season, or we're going to be facing fines, sanctions, potential up to loss of European competition. That seems unlikely, given that we're not talking about large scale issues, but still, it's a concern. And we're still going to see player sales to reduce that wage bill, and we're still going to see player sales because Villa are still in a position where they have to be horse trading, buy to sell. You can't, or sell to buy, I should say. You can't. We are not in a position where we can just splash a bunch of cash because we sold the women's team to ourselves.
Agreed. Also, the other one that we never mentioned was Leon Bailey.
Oh yeah, so,
You know
yeah.
the
Well, we kind of talked about him a lot at the end of the season, right? Like
Yeah,
everybody knows
big
about
favorite of the
Jalen.
pod. We did say this recently, the news around him, what seemed to be an imminent move to Saudi Arabia, seems to have cooled. Now, granted, he has been playing with Jamaica at the Gold Cup.
Yeah.
So perhaps when the competition ends and they're eliminated, we wind up hearing something in fairly short order about his move. But maybe this is one that they're able to keep. We've talked repeatedly about Unai Emery's apparent admiration for Leon Bailey and his leadership. He is someone who clearly feels very attached to the club as much as Emi Martinez does. So do they find a middle ground now that they have a little bit of the money to have him agree to a wage reduction so that he can stick around and continue to be a leader on and off the pitch? Maybe. Don't you laugh at me. So he's an interesting one. Maybe he winds up falling actually now into the right price, unlocks it, but I'm still leaving him in the pushing out the door category.
I think you're probably right there. That's where I had him as well. Yeah.
Chris, anything else on this one?
I think we pretty well covered it. It's a good day, but we're not out of the woods. Like this isn't cause for rampant celebration and champagne and all that fun stuff. It's a good day to be clear of PSR, but now the cycle starts all over again, and we're going to be having these same sort of conversations in a year's time.
Well, I'm glad that you referred to it as horse trading because I am an avid horse girl, and I look forward to seeing what horse moves are made over the course of the next week until we talk again. Have a good July 4th, my friend. Have a good travel to the beach, and I will talk to you soon. But in the meantime, as always, up the Villa.
Up the Villa.
Hi, Mom and Dad.